Before I start talking, were there any questions or comments from last week? All right, so I had a few afterthoughts that I'll share with you briefly. I wanted to share a significant Bible verse. Hebrews 12:1, the beginning of it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses." And so last week, the people that I talked about, they're part of that great cloud of witnesses. They're surrounding us. So I had to make a decision last week. I could have just said, under the reign of Queen Mary, the first 300 people were executed for their faith, and left it at that. But I decided, obviously, not to do that because of a couple reasons. Here come a couple of our people. I wanted to, initially I thought, well, I'm going to go through, and any time that 3 or more people were killed together, I would mention it, but that would have taken too long. We'd still be going. I eliminated all the ones where there were 3, and I went with 4 or more to save a bit of time. But the reason I did that the way I did it was to honor those people, that there are forerunners, are part of the cloud of witnesses, and also obviously for a dramatic effect to drive home the fact that it's just a relentless, steady, week after week after week of people being killed for their faith. The second thing I wanted to mention, and we saw examples of it most weeks we've been going, is it's sad but true that people who claim to be following God, Christians, will persecute other Christians. And so in Europe, you can think when the Lutheran Church began with Martin Luther, Roman Catholics persecuted the Lutherans. And then after the Lutherans came, it was called the Reformed Church, led by a guy from Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli. The Lutherans persecuted the Reformed people. The Reformed people in Belleville would be at Maranatha, Christian Reformed Church. They were persecuted by the Lutherans. And then the Anabaptists came along, and they were persecuted by the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans and the Reformed people because of something they believed. Yes?
What's Anabaptist?
Anabaptist literally means baptize again. And so it was something new. They did not believe in infant baptism. You might want to move so I can keep an eye on you. Yes. I'm talking to the lady behind you, Gord, not you. Oh, okay. Okay. There we go. Oh, yeah. Now I can see it. The Anabaptists, the big deal was they thought when you have faith in Jesus as a person old enough to make that decision, then you get baptized, instead of as a little baby when you have nothing to do with it. Primarily because of that, everybody else hated them. The Roman Catholics hated them. The Lutherans hated them. The Reformed Church hated them. And they killed them in some notorious, cruel ways that I won't go off on. A third thing I wanted to mention is you saw some of the pictures in the last couple of weeks of people being burned at the stake. I don't know if you realize in every picture there's a big crowd of people watching. And so that kind of preys on my mind a little bit, and so I wonder, some of those people might have gone to show some support for their friend who's getting killed, perhaps, or to pray for them. But I imagine a good part of the crowd is there for entertainment value, which is an interesting concept. And so there is something in our fallen human nature that revels in watching violence. And so it happened, for example, in Roman times, thousands, tens of thousands of people would crowd into a stadium to watch gladiators fight to the death or watch Christians being tortured and killed.
Could they have maybe been um, ordered to go to that just because
It's possible, but not that I'm aware of. I think it was a voluntary thing to be there. Now, here in Canada, we used to have public hangings. And so the last public hanging in Canada, and so this would be hundreds of people would show up to watch this person be executed. The last one in Canada took place on December 11th, 1962. I was 7 years old. Some people would be old enough to remember this. The last public hanging in Kingston was in 1949, and the last public hanging here in Belleville, which would have taken place right across the road at the courthouse, 1941. As I recall reading that story, it was a husband and wife who were hung together. And so perhaps some of the motivation for executing a person publicly is to teach the crowd a lesson. Beware. If you do, Jim, if you do what this person did, and you show up having an English Bible, what is happening to them could happen to you. So you better smarten up. So maybe that's part of the idea. So there's still lots of violent entertainment happens around the world. For example, bullfighting, some people would find gruesome. It's called cockfighting or rooster fighting, where two birds will fight to the death. Is theoretically illegal. More than theoretically, it is. Dog fighting, that still happens sometimes. Two dogs will fight to the death. And then in our tamer times, we still have boxing, professional wrestling, mixed martial arts fighting, where anything goes. So there's still this desire in us to watch violence. Hockey, yeah. Yeah, and some people get upset if there's no fights. They go for the fights. Or car races where they go to watch the crashes and get excited by that. In the year 200, one of the, he's referred to as a church father, his name was Tertullian, and he said, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, which is an interesting statement. The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. And what happened during the Roman persecutions, and also in England, killing people by the hundreds did not stop the growth of Christianity or of Protestantism. In fact, more people became believers. So it has a reverse effect, which is kind of interesting. Any other questions or comments on any of that? These are things I think about as I'm lying in bed at night, wondering on these things. Hey, Pop. We'll start where we left off. I'm just going to back up just slightly for a review for those who might have missed last week. We're talking in the rain. Yes, Peggy?
Excuse me, but so did I understand correctly last week you said that the directive to hang or not hang or burn was just about whatever the king's whim was?
Yeah, basically. And so if you think of it as a pendulum, we had Henry VIII, who was essentially a Roman Catholic, and then because he wanted to divorce his wife and the Roman Catholic Church wouldn't let him do it, he decided, well, forget it, I'll have my own Church of England now. And he started slightly moving towards a more Protestant view, but in his thinking he was still very Roman Catholic. 63 people were executed for their faith during his reign. And then his son, Edward VI, was very Protestant, and so the pendulum swung way over here. And then Mary, known as Bloody Mary, the pendulum swung way back again. And so now we're in Queen Elizabeth, who's attempting to keep the pendulum in the middle, trying to be somewhat neutral. So that's where we're up to now. Mary reigned for 45 years. She became the queen in 1558. She was 25 years old at the time. And so she was the queen for 45 years, which is a pretty long time back then. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who was wife number 2 out of 6. And as we mentioned, her father had her mother beheaded when Elizabeth was 2 years, 8 months old. That wasn't very nice. When Elizabeth came to the throne, she was more or less a Protestant. But Roman Catholics in England were not happy. They thought that one of Elizabeth's relatives, who was also another Mary, she was the Queen in Scotland. And we know her as Mary, Queen of Scots. Avril, have you heard of Mary, Queen of Scots? Since last week, I've actually spent quite a number of hours studying Mary, Queen of Scots, trying to figure her out. Her life is very convoluted, and so part of the process of presenting something to you is, what do I eliminate so I don't spend the whole night talking about Mary, Queen of Scots? So when we come to her, I'm just going to touch on some things, but she's a key character. Anyway, she was very staunchly Roman Catholic, and all the Roman Catholics in England were not happy that Elizabeth had become the queen. They thought Mary, Queen of Scots, should have become the queen of England as well as Scotland, and we're going to hear more about that later. All right, here we go. 1561, the first complete Polish Bible comes out. So this is happening all around Europe. Things like this are happening. 1562, Tim, the slave trade starts. This has nothing to do with how we got the Bible, but it has everything to do with the atmosphere of the time. And so this started in October 1562 and carries on for almost 300 years. And I've got a graph there. So this is Queen Elizabeth we're looking at. Tim, I've got a bunch of pictures that have to do with the slave trade. This produced a very profitable enough that it lasted for 300 years. It was essentially a triangular system where, so here's a ship loaded out with a cargo of humans. The way the triangle worked was a ship would leave England loaded with a cargo of textiles and iron and alcohol and weapons. These would go to Africa, on the west coast of Africa. They would empty the cargo out, sell it, and then from African slave traders, these were not white people going out and capturing Africans. These were Africans capturing Africans. They would sell those people to the captain, and they would load up their new cargo, and they would head over to sometimes northern South America, the Caribbean, and the eastern shore of the United States. They would unload that cargo, sell them, and then they would load up with a new cargo to go back to England. And so the new cargo would be sugar, molasses, coffee, tobacco, wood, whale oil, fish, and furs. And so this system worked extremely well for almost 300 years. And Michelle, the only people it didn't work well for were the slaves. But part of the thinking, and so I've actually spent quite a bit of time studying this as well, and I've read a number of books on this whole thing. Part of the way that Christians were able to do this was, well, they would find things in the Bible that they thought supported it, but a major part of the thinking is, these people are not humans. I am a human because my skin is white. These people are not human.
So who was the first person who ever came up with that? You said they were their own kind, selling their own kind?
Yes. Well, that's the way it happened.
So their own kind decided that they were black too.
But I'm saying the rationale in Christian white people was, these people are property. It's like a table or a dog.
Yeah. So obviously the black people who were selling them off.
Yeah, so that was more like they were prisoners of war sort of thing. We'd go out and capture people. Yes, sir.
I was talking not long ago with a person who was very involved with the so-called untouchables, or they call it in India. And he said that as far as Hindu belief is concerned, the untouchables are not given.
Yeah. So this carries on today. And so that if you're not a human, then some people feel I can do things to you that I couldn't do to a human. Like some people treat dogs badly, or I remember even as a child.
But you go to jail for that now.
Now you do.
Dogs, like,
Yeah.
people worship dogs, some think more than they respect humans.
Yeah, or other people.
Like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. Yeah.
I remember as a child, some boys thought, oh, wouldn't it be funny to put a firecracker in the mouth of a frog and blow the frog up? Even as a child, I thought that was horrendous. But again, it's the sinful nature in people, and it comes out in ways like this. Anyway, I don't...
Hot topic, Robert, hot topic.
Yeah, I know. This goes on, but here's where it comes back. It was Christians who began to denounce this. It goes on for almost 300 years, and a famous Christian in England, his name is William Wilberforce. They've made movies about him. He poured his whole life into trying to stop this. And so eventually it happened. So in England, in 1807, they abolished participation in the slave trade. I think they thought in their head, if we abolish these ships taking people over to be slaves, then slavery will stop. But no, it didn't stop at all, because millions of people had been transported. They were having babies. I just got a free slave because these two slaves just had a baby. And so it carries on. And so it was finally abolished in the English Empire. They passed a law in 1833, and they gave them time to get used to, okay, I got to figure out another way to earn my living here. So it took effect in 1834. Slavery was abolished in the United States after the Civil War. They had to have a war over it. In 1865, during the administration of Abraham Lincoln, I got him shot in the head because a lot of people weren't very happy with him. All right, proceeding on. Yes.
You mentioned that figure you mentioned. It started 15.
It started, now it started in England. It's been going on forever. 1562.
Was when it started in England.
This is when an English ship took the first load of slaves over to the Caribbean in 1562. Slavery's in the Old Testament. Slavery's in the New Testament. In Roman times, in the times the New Testament was written, in the Roman Empire, between 50 and 60% of all people were slaves. That's a lot of people.
50, 60%, and were they always all wild?
No, that could be anybody.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But they weren't necessarily slaves as you saw them.
Yeah, they'd be more, we might think of them as servants. Where they are a slave is you work for 60 years and you never make a cent. But you're treated, maybe you're not whipped and so on, chained up.
Some of them were lawyers and educators.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. 1563. Matthew Parker is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he publishes a very famous thing. It's still in existence today. It's called the 39 Articles. I think L. Reimers might have heard of the 39 Articles, because in the back of the Book of Common Prayer, they're printed. And I grew up in the Anglican Church, and I used to study the 39 Articles. While people were going up for communion, it'd take a long time. I'd read the 39 Articles. I've read them many, many times, and I'm going to talk about it briefly here. They were a condensation of Thomas Cranmer's 42 Articles, which came out in 1552, 11 years earlier. Now, Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, had been burned at the stake under Queen Mary. And so I actually encourage you, Google the 39 Articles. It's a very good summary of Protestant belief. It's remarkably concise, and accurate for most things. And I'm going to comment on some of them. They're revised in 1571, and after 1571, they're printed in that book. Did you bring it with you, Al? Would you mind passing that around again? So you can find them in the Book of Common Prayer if you visit an Anglican church, or you can find them online. Every Anglican church or Episcopalian church will have these. Here's a few comments. Number 3, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here. Number 3 out of the 39 says that between when Jesus died and he rose from the dead, that he went to hell. And that's actually not true. That would be a better word if they said he went to Hades rather than he went to hell. And it has to do with that's how the King James translated it. I won't go off on that. Number 6 mentions that the books of the Old Testament Apocrypha, which we're going to talk about next week, are not authoritative and should not be used to establish doctrine, unlike the Roman Catholic Church. That's next week. Number 22 talks about purgatory. And I'm going to read a quote. This is from the 39 Articles. The Romish doctrine concerning purgatory, pardons, worshipping and adoration, as well as images as of relics, and also invocation of saints, is a fond thing vainly invented, and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the Word of God. That's a good sentence. Number 23, I disagree with. It says if you're going to preach or serve communion, you have to be ordained. And in the Anglican Church, that may be the case. Number 27, I disagree with. And that has to do with infant baptism, which is the Anglican practice. Number 28 comments on communion and includes several comments on the Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Michelle, what was that? Do you remember?
Oh, that was the subject of the actual bread being literal body, Christ's body.
Yeah. Just stop while you're ahead.
Stop, crazy.
You're right. And so that's the belief that the bread and the wine literally, physically becomes the actual body of Jesus. And there's a whole lot of stuff associated with that I better not go off on either. But here's a good sentence about that. This is from the 39 Articles. Transubstantiation, or the change of the substance of bread and wine in the supper of the Lord, cannot be proved by Holy Writ, meaning the Bible, but is repugnant to the plain words of Scripture, overthroweth the nature of a sacrament, and hath given occasion to many superstitions. That's a good sentence too. Number 30 of the 39 says that unlike the Roman Catholic Church, in communion, lay people, non-ordained people, can get the bread and the wine, not just the bread. To this day, in a Roman Catholic Church, you only get bread. You don't get the wine. Number 32 is a significant one. It says that priests are allowed to get married. That's a big one. And number 37 deals with a bunch of things, but includes the fact the Pope has no authority over the Church of England. All right, we'll leave that. I do encourage you, go and Google it, and it's excellent reading. 1962, Queen Elizabeth has smallpox, which can kill you. In her case, I've mentioned it a couple times in the past, it leaves her with horrible skin blemishes, and after that she wears very heavy makeup. The main ingredient, Michelle, of the makeup? Lead. Does anyone know that lead is poisonous? That's why we don't have lead in paint anymore, and we don't have lead in gasoline, because it will slowly kill you. To get that white look, like that, you use lead. And so you're putting lead on your face. Also, smallpox left her half bald, and so she wore a wig for the rest of her life, as many women did. She also had problems with her teeth and ended up losing most of her teeth, which affected her speech. Tim, John Foxe is next. 1563, John Foxe publishes a book that is still in print almost 500 years later. It's called Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And there's John Foxe, and there's a picture of his book here too. He was inspired particularly by what had happened to Christians during the reign of Mary, and so he basically did investigative reporting and found out the stories of these people. I mentioned some of them last week. He went and found out every story of every person, and he published a book about it. Plus, he went back to Roman days and basically a history of martyrs for their faith up until that time. And I've read that book. It's come out in modern English, and you can get abridged versions and so on. It's a fascinating and inspiring book to read. 1564, the word Puritan starts being used, and as many of these words are, including the word Christian, it's used in a negative sense, as an insult. Bob, you're a Puritan.
I was told that just the other day.
There you go, it's still in use. Basically, a Puritan is like a ultra-Protestant, and so they've gone further than the Church of England had gone. And so the Puritans fell into two groups at this time. Some were willing to work within the system. They stayed within the Church of England, thinking, I can effect change from within the system. Now, after doing that for a long time, Al, some Puritans in frustration gave up on working within the system because they got tired of banging their head against the wall. And so they decided to leave the Church of England and try to do something else. Examples from the 1700s, perfect example would be two brothers named John and Charles. Steve, what's their last name? Wesley. They started out in the Church of England, in the Anglican Church, working within the system, and after a while, banging their head against the wall, they decided we have to leave. We're going to do something different. Puritans emphasize personal and group piety or holiness. Bob, if you were called a Puritan, I would take that as a compliment. You're saying, you're a holy person, and therefore I hate you. So the Puritans, a word that's used to describe what they saw in church or what they hoped for in church is congregationalist. And if you Google that word, there's many churches that fall under the umbrella of being congregationalist. And what that means is each local group independently does their own thing. There's no big denomination that tells us what to do. There's no hierarchical military style levels of authority working your way up the ladder sort of thing. It's very local. There's a group of people. There's maybe a few elders within that group. This is what we're going to do. And we don't care what the group in Trenton is doing or the group in Napanee, etc. We're doing our thing. All right, moving on. 1565, a guy named Theodore Beza, and I've got pictures of him, Tim. He publishes his first version of the Greek New Testament. This keeps happening. Remember, 1516, Erasmus had published the first Greek New Testament of modern times. Well, this guy, he's quite a scholar. He publishes 9 editions over the years between 1565 and 1604. He brings out 9 different versions of the Greek New Testament. And then even after he died in 1605, in 1611, a 10th edition came out that he had been working on but hadn't published yet. And so when the King James Version is translated, they consult heavily with his work. Now, we're going to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, a little bit. And so it's such a convoluted story that I'm going to break with what I've been doing so far, just going in chronological order, because you'll forget all the stuff that happened. So I'm going to try to keep this brief if I can. 1542, Mary is born. Her father is King James V of Scotland. His last name is Stuart, the Stuart dynasty. He dies when Mary is 6 days old. So Mary becomes the Queen of Scotland when she is 6 days old. She has, they're referred to as regents, who would rule on her behalf until she comes of age. Henry VIII of England is her great uncle. And so this is part of the deal, that she was in the lineup to become the Queen of England. Henry VIII arranges a treaty whereby his 6-year-old son, Edward, gets engaged to Mary. Mary's 6 months old, Edward's 6 years old. They're now engaged, and they're going to get married later on. But Scotland breaks the treaty. 6 months, the engagement is off. So there is a problem. Now, Mary is a fervent Roman Catholic throughout her life. 1548, Mary, and the dates get a little mixed up. I've read quite a bit on this, and people keep coming at me with different dates. So I'm just going from the year she was born, and I could be off a year here and there. But when Mary is 6 years old, she gets engaged to Francis, the son of King Henry II of France, who's about 4 years old. So she's engaged again. She's 6, he's 4. She actually gets sent to France, and she stays there for 13 years, becomes very well educated. She can speak 6 languages: French, Italian, Latin, Spanish, Greek, and Scottish. When she's 16, we're now up to 1558. When she's 16, she marries Francis. This is husband number 1. He's 14, she's 16, they're now married. He's the son of the King of France. Now, as soon as Francis marries her, he's now the King of Scotland. Unfortunately, 1 year later, Henry II of France is, who knows what a jousting match is? John, do you know what jousting is?
Yes, a couple of guys on horses with long length that charge at each other.
Yeah.
Try to knock a guy off.
Usually, if you're the king, your opponent would probably miss if he's smart. Well, what happened, the opponent didn't miss, and Henry was killed. His son, Francis, who's now 15, he becomes the King of France. Mary's 17, she also becomes the Queen of France, as well as the Queen of Scotland. 1 year later, Francis dies at the age of 16. So Mary is now a widow at the age of 18. 5 years later, at the age of 23, she marries her first cousin, Henry Stuart. The next year, they have a baby. This baby is going to be important. His name is James. We're going to hear about him, because there's actually a version of the Bible named after him. And so that's where he's going to come back in.
Who was your cousin?
Henry Stuart.
Robert,
Yes.
was it common in that culture to be married at such a young age? Like
Yes.
14, 15, that wasn't exceptional.
Right. But to marry your first cousin was. And so there were people that weren't happy about that. Now, the next year, 1567, Henry Stuart, her second husband, is murdered. See, this is me restraining myself from going off on tangents.
Well done.
The same year, So a couple months after her husband number 2 is married, she marries husband number 3, who happens to be the main person who was suspected of organizing the murder. And he went on trial, but he was acquitted. And so she was also tainted that she was involved with the murder of husband number 2 in order to marry husband number 3. His name is James Hepburn. And Steve, did we not know a guy years ago named Jim Hepburn? That name comes back to me. Anyway, James Hepburn. He divorced his wife and then 12 days later married Mary. Now, the people in Scotland are sitting back like you thinking, man, this is like a soap opera. And they didn't like it. And so they actually rebelled. And Mary, at the age of 25, is forced to give up the throne of Scotland. Her husband is exiled, goes off to Denmark to sit in jail. He goes insane and dies in 1578. And so when Mary is forced to exit being the Queen of Scotland, her son, James, who is now James VI of Scotland, he's 13 months old. He's now the King of Scotland.
And what happens to her?
Well, we're about to find out. James is 13 months old. He is the King of Scotland now. He never sees his mother again the rest of his life. 1568 in May, Mary, she's been hanging out in Scotland, but it becomes too hot for her there. She's got to leave. So she flees to England and seeks the protection of her second cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Now, there are so many Roman Catholics in England who think Mary should be the queen, not Elizabeth, that she's placed under house arrest. And she spends the next 19 years under house arrest because Elizabeth can't trust her for good reason. And so she spends the rest of her life under arrest. Now, for a little detour, 1567, the first New Testament in Welsh comes out. And then in 1568, Tim, the Bishop's Bible comes out. This is a revision of the Great Bible that was published in 1539. And that was the first Bible that had ever been authorized for use in churches in England.
And it says gospel. Gospel.
That's so that.
Is that what you were talking about last week?
Yeah, I'm going to talk more about this later. Yeah, the Bishop's Bible. Let me just back up here. So this was produced under the direction of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker. One of the weaknesses of the Great Bible from 1539 was most of the Old Testament was actually translated from the Latin Vulgate rather from Hebrew. The most popular Bible in England at this time is the Geneva Bible. There's people here who weren't here last time, so I'll pass this around. This actually came out in 1560, and it was extremely popular in England, and the Church of England did not like it because it was too Puritan. It had footnotes and so on. It was a study Bible, and they didn't like it. And so they decided, we're going to produce our own Bible, and it's called the Bishop's Bible. And the interesting thing was each book in the Bible was translated by a different person. Some did an excellent job, some did not. And so this book was quite erratic. Some of the books of the Bible were basically almost exactly the same as the Great Bible of 1539, and some ended up being actually very similar to the Geneva Bible that's going around there. So it was quite uneven. It was officially authorized by the Church of England to be used, but the general population didn't like it, and they never accepted it. They stuck with that book that's being passed around. The Bishop's Bible was reprinted about 50 times right up until 1617. As you probably saw, there's Queen Elizabeth prominently displayed on the front page there. kings and queens like that to be on the front page of the Bible because they're the head of the church. 1569, the first complete Bible in Spanish is published. Now we're going to move up to 1570. A very important thing happened in England. And it happened because of a pope. And Tim, I have pictures of him. Pope Pius V. He was the pope for 6 years, from 1566 to 1572. In 1570, he declares, as the head of God's church on earth, Queen Elizabeth is a heretic. And he excommunicates her, which means she is going to hell. He orders that Elizabeth must be removed from office as the Queen of England, and he asks France and Spain to help make this happen. He releases all the people of England from any allegiance to Elizabeth. He orders all Roman Catholics in England to rebel against Queen Elizabeth. Any Catholic in England who obeys any order of Queen Elizabeth will be excommunicated and will go to hell. And the Pope declares Mary, Queen of Scots, should be the Queen of England. She's currently under house arrest. Now, as a result of this command of the Pope, and if you're a Roman Catholic, you have to obey the Pope, there are numerous Roman Catholic plots and attempts to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth develops the CIA, basically, a secret service of spies trying to find out all these plots of people trying to kill her. The government officials find a key question to ask Catholics. Apparently people were honest at this time. Bob, if you're a Catholic, and I was a government official, I'd ask you, if the Pope sends troops to invade England, who are you going to be loyal to, the Pope or Queen Elizabeth? And so if you say the Pope, that means you want to kill Elizabeth. And if you say Queen Elizabeth, that means you're not a good Catholic. So to avoid being in this quandary, a lot of Roman Catholics decide, I'm just going to move to France instead of staying here. This is too hot. Now, interestingly, Pope Pius V, I'm jumping forward in history, he was beatified by the Roman Catholic Church 100 years later in 1672. He died in 1572. To be beatified, if you Google it, you will discover this means that the current Pope 100 years later had discovered that Pope Pius V had now left purgatory. He had only been in purgatory for 100 years, burning off his sins, and he's now entered heaven. And so now, 100 years after his death, you can now pray to Pope Pius V, and you can still pray to him now. The theory is he, Bob, will take your prayers and take them to Jesus, hopefully. And then 40 years later, he was canonized as an official saint, which is even holier than being beatified. And so the Roman Catholic Church thinks very highly of him, and so you can still pray to him today. Now, moving back to Elizabeth, for the first 12 years of her reign, she had, as we already talked, she had taken this middle road. She'd been very neutral towards Roman Catholics. She had no problem with you being a Roman Catholic. However, she got a little testy when Roman Catholics were trying to kill her left and right. And so this causes a bit of a clampdown for the remaining 33 years of her reign. She still maintains this middle road to a large extent. She says, I don't want any Roman Catholics to be arrested just for being Roman Catholic. Only if they have actually participated in a treasonous act like trying to kill me. Then they should be arrested. And over the next 33 years, from 1570 to 1603, 153 Roman Catholics are arrested and executed for treason. In 1572, the Bishop's Bible, the one we've been talking about, undergoes a major revision, and interestingly, it becomes more similar to the Geneva Bible, which is out there someplace going around. At the same time, so all this is happening at the same time. It's interesting. 1572, August 23rd, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre begins. And Tim, I have pictures of this. This begins in Paris, France, and spreads outward to 12 nearby cities. So it happens in 13 cities in France, and it's an attempt by the Roman Catholics in those cities to kill every Protestant, man, woman, and child. Observers at the time, the estimates range from 30,000 to 70,000 men, women, and children are killed
Within how many?
within a 3-week period within 13 cities near
Okay, yeah.
Paris. Most of the bodies are thrown into the rivers. And so which is a bad idea because you get your drinking water from the rivers. And so there's so many, like tens of thousands of dead floating bodies in the rivers of France that they suddenly discover. Now, remember at the time, rivers were also used as sewers, as it was here in Belleville in days gone by. And so the water was never that great anyway, but the water becomes undrinkable for 3 months because of all the rotting bodies floating down the rivers, Protestant bodies. Now in this case, it appears to have worked because I Googled what percentage of the French population today is Protestant, and it's 2%. So that's kind of interesting. So that's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre because it started on St. Bartholomew's Day. He was a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. So all this is happening all at the same time. 1574, 2 years after this, a new edition of the Bishop's Bible comes out. And because they've been reading this publicly in church, this edition of the Bishop's Bible has sections that are marked off. This passage is not edifying and should not be read in public. Steve, you can perhaps imagine, I don't know what passages they would be, but we could probably think of some of them. That don't read this part of the Bible in public, Bob, because it's not edifying, is what we're going to say about it. 1575, the Geneva New Testament is printed in England